Hey guys, if you've seen the David Attenborough series, 7 Worlds, 1 Planet, then you probably recognise this bear. They're in Russia and they've gone down by the volcano and they're just... I think it's to get the fresh grass because everywhere else is snowy at the moment. I've already done another landscape piece and there will likely be other landscape pieces. So first off, I just start with a sketch like I always do. I do a few things a little bit differently to what I normally do with this drawing because I'm always trying different techniques to try and improve. Because I'm at that stage where I don't particularly like the style I'm drawing in. I'm trying to get away from the pencil texture tool in Procreate because I use that all the time. And you can see I've drawn swirly lines in the sky because when I saw this frame of the bear on the show, I was thinking that would look really nice if the mist was swirly and smoky and a little bit stylized. I'm trying to make the bear a little stylized as well, so I'm exaggerating the curves and the edges, making it a little bit more jaggedy with straighter lines. And I mess around with the colour palette, seeing what works. I went with mainly greens and reds because they're complementary colours. It's just easier to stick to complementary rules when you're not quite sure with the colours. That's what I think anyway. And once I decided on the colours, I just started blocking in the general shapes of the bear. So I've got the lights and darks in mind, like where the light's hitting the bear on the face, and it's a little bit darker towards its chest. And I'm trying to stick with red tones near the top of the bear and blue tones near the bottom. Because the green grass will have a little bit of blue in it as well. So I'm just trying to balance out the colours in the image a bit so it all feels cohesive. I like to do this thing where I add a gradient to each of the flat shapes because it just makes the image look a little bit more dynamic at the end. I feel like when I don't do that, it's really easy for it to look a little bit boring and stiff. But changing up the colours just slightly makes it a lot more interesting, I guess. Once I've figured out the general colours and different gradients and things, I'm looking at different textures I could add because like I said, I'm just improvising. I don't really know where it's taking me. I'm looking at things like the artist Crayon and Nikko Rull, I think it's called. Yeah, the Nikko Rull brush under painting, and just different textures that I can add like subtly to the different colours because I want some lines to be quite sharp, but I want the texture within the bear, like the hair, to be quite subtle. And here I've decided I want a little bit of texture around the edges of the bear, so I still want nice straight lines, but a little bit of hair showing. So I've added a layer underneath, I've added the hair texture, and then I make another layer as a clipping mask, and I take the colours from the bear that's already there and add it to the hair, if that makes sense. I really started experimenting when I started doing the little shapes of the hair on the bear, because I really didn't know what I wanted. So first I'm just variating the colour slightly, so a little bit more towards the red or maybe towards the blue, making it a tiny bit darker. I'm trying to stay quite close to the original brownish red tone because I don't want it to be too jarring, like the colour difference. And again, I'm making sure the red tones are towards the top and the blue tones are towards the bottom. And even with these little scribbly textures, I'm adding a gradient just to make it a little bit more smooth. And I've added a bit of a rim light to the top of the bear. I didn't actually see this in the original image, but I'm trying to exaggerate the lights and exaggerate the darks exaggerate the shapes, just to make it a more aesthetic image. I feel like professional artists are really good at stylizing things. Like, it's one thing to copy an image exactly the same, you know, it kind of tells you what to do a bit, but changing the drawing to be like more simple or stylized is a whole challenge in itself. When I added the fur texture with the pen tool, I was making sure I didn't have too many gaps in it. Like, I didn't want it to look scribbly, I want it to look a little bit more controlled than just random, you know, hairs everywhere. I'm thinking about how I'm using my pen, how hard I'm pressing down so I get those tapering edges. I'm blocking shapes together and then feathering them out just to make it look a little bit nicer. I've always had a bit of a problem with tone variation, so my darks aren't quite dark enough and my lights aren't light enough. A good test to do if you think you don't have enough variation, you can turn it to black and white, and then you can see if, you know, if it kind of blurs into one big mess, you know that you haven't really used a lot of the tone spectrum. You haven't gone dark enough and you haven't gone light enough. I think that's the main thing I'm trying to overcome at the moment, is just adding really light lights, really dark darks. This was quite a challenging one though, because obviously the reference image, that's a very greyed out image. It's not, you know, it's not got dark shadows and light lights, but something to help with darker shadows without making it look flat is using a multiply layer. If you've watched any other artists draw digitally, you've probably heard about multiply layers and other types of layers that mix the colors, so you can kind of lower the opacity, so make it a little bit see-through, and it will enhance the colors underneath. So I've chosen quite a bright saturated blue for this shadow, but the multiply layer kind of mixed it with the layers underneath and made it this nice deep subtle purpley color, and it looks quite nice as the shadow. I used the same method for the grass that I used for doing the hair on the bear, so that's using a clipping mask with black underneath, and then just taking the colour that's already there and spreading it along the grass blades. And I've used a multiply layer for blue shadows on the grass as well, just to match it with the bear a bit. And again, it's quite similar. The grass is similar to the bear's hair. I've added texture, but making sure it's got clumps and spaces, just a nice balance of shapes. Moving on to the sky, I've added a little bit of variation of like very, very subtle lilacs and blues, and I'm keeping it quite desaturated. I don't want it too harsh. I wasn't really sure how to go about doing the clouds in the sky or the swirls. I wasn't sure what tools I was going to use, so I was just really experimenting here. So I duplicated the layer that was already there and I brightened it and tried rubbing that out to see if that worked. That was a little bit harsh, so I lowered the opacity of that layer. I basically continue doing that. I'm adding different details and different layers, lowering the opacity so it's not so harsh of a difference. And I get my original sketch back up so I can follow the swirls I drew. And I end up changing these swirls a little bit because they were a little stiff, even though they were from the a sketch which normally has nice loose shapes. It still felt a little bit stiff, so I add different shapes later on. I think what really made the sky work was when I grabbed the selection tool, drew cloud shapes, and then I got the Spraypaint tool on the medium nozzle, and I sprayed along the edge of the line I drew very, very lightly, and then I lowered the opacity so it gave the shape of the cloud but without having to use any line work. You can see I used that method on the left hand side and just did a big line because I was trying to follow the path of that big swirl towards the place above the head of the bear, but that really didn't work with the rest of the shape, so I ended up getting rid of that. And with the edges of the clouds, they were looking a little bit stiff for what I wanted, so I got the rubber in a pencil texture and just lightly brushed along the edges so it was a little bit softer. I added a few clouds over the top of the bear just to blend him in with the background because he was standing out a little bit too much, and I feel like this really brought the illustration together. And here's the final image. I ended up lowering the opacity of the lines, like the pencil lines in the sky, loads, because I kind of like the subtlety of it. Here's the other landscape image I was talking about. So this is from episode 1, Antarctica. I just loved this shot of these two big icebergs. They were just really jarring. It just inspired me to draw. If you haven't watched the new David Attenborough series, I highly recommend it. I've always loved watching animal documentaries, but this one is brilliant. There's really beautiful shots, and it's always a good watch in my opinion. If you stayed this long, thank you for watching, and I hope to make another video soon.